Hello, Molweni, Sanu, Hujambo, I'm Tembekile Mkhototo. Welcome to Unwrap Africa, where every week we focus on the latest news, trends and successes of the African continent. Siyaqhaqha. Coming up on the show tonight, Tanzania is stepping up preparations ahead of the 2027 Africa Cup of Nations, which it will host, by the way, co-host with Kenya and Uganda. And then later this hour, we'll look at ways that South Africa can better secure port control, as well as cut costs and restore trade competitiveness. Tonight, I want to hear your thoughts on the situation in Egypt. Should other African countries, we're asking, follow Egypt's lead in restricting social media access for minors? We'll take your commentary on WhatsApp. The number to use is +27 8459 1897. That's +27 78459 1897. You can also find us on Facebook, SABC Unwrap Africa, and on X via SABC News_TV. Well, let's have a look at the main stories from the continent this week. Search and rescue efforts are continuing in Mozambique after weeks of heavy rain that have caused severe flooding. Officials say more than 100 people have died, with more than 650,000 displaced.
I find the petition lacks merit and I hereby dismiss the same in its entirety. Each party shall bear its own costs.
Kenya's High Court dismisses a petition seeking to hold the government liable for alleged security failures linked to the 1998 US embassy bombing in the country. This delivered a major setback to survivors and the families of those who died. They've spent nearly 3 decades trying to fight for some level of accountability.
Things they have demolished the whole place. Every of my customers have scattered away, and the business is not going again.
Thousands of people who lived in the historic Makgakwe waterfront community, that's in Nigeria's Lagos, have now been left homeless. It's after authorities demolished their stilt houses, displacing families who've lived in that area for generations. The Egyptian parliament says it's working on legislation to regulate children's exposure to what it's termed the digital chaos of social media. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has urged MPs to pass the law which limits young people's use of social media platforms.
They took a decision yesterday, and I think, of course, you've seen the sanctions, which are a very clear message that such acts are unacceptable, and there is no room for this in African football.
The Confederation of African Football's disciplinary body has imposed heavy sanctions on the Senegal and Moroccan football federations, as well as certain players and officials for their role in the chaotic end to the African Cup of Nations final in Rabat earlier this year.
Head of state in court, him get him power over him own country everywhere.
And 30 years after his death, Nigerian Afrobeat legend Fela Kuti will receive a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammys in the United States this year. He will be the first African to achieve the honor since the award was introduced in 1963. So Tanzania has stepped up preparations ahead of the 2027 Africa Cup of Nations, which it will co-host with Kenya and Uganda. The government says it wants to not only host a great tournament, but to strengthen grassroots football development for generations to come. But the hosting comes at a difficult time. Last month's AFCON ended with chaotic scenes, ensuing crowd violence as well as negative global headlines. SABC's Isaac Lukando reports.
There are just over 500 days to go until the first 90 minutes of the 2027 Africa Cup of Nations. Stadium refurbishment and construction is on target as Tanzania prepares to host with East African neighbors Kenya and Uganda. But the aim extends well beyond improved professional facilities. Investment is being put into infrastructure, youth talent identification, and specialized training programs for teachers and coaches.
People who are passionate about football will receive professional training. They will go into schools. They help nurture young players under proper guidance. The certificates they receive will allow them to advance to higher CAF coaching levels, ensuring they're officially recognised by both the National Federation and CAF.
Tanzania has made only 4 previous AFCON appearances, with its best performance being a round of 16 finish. Analysts are hoping they can do better at their home tournament, but acknowledge that there are wider benefits to consider.
The president being very supportive of sports, giving out funds sometimes to national teams, giving out funds to teams that do well in the African international club tournaments. I feel there's a good support from the top person in the country, something that could now run through the whole system of the game.
Hosting duties come at a difficult time. Last month's chaotic AFCON final saw Senegal walk off in protest, fan violence and global headlines that marred the tournament. Analysts expect greater oversight from FIFA ahead of 2027. FIFA President Gianni Infantino says he plans to visit Tanzania again later this year, and the country is taking hosting duties seriously. The government says it has increased spending on sports infrastructure by more than 700% in recent years.
For decades, Tanzania has not been regarded as a football powerhouse, but with local clubs now featuring among Africa's top 10, increased participation in continental tournaments, and the opportunity to host the continent's biggest football event, officials believe the country is positioned to reshape its football narrative.
Fans are hoping for a strong showing from the men's team, but a lasting legacy for grassroots Tanzanian football long after the tournament ends might be the ultimate victory. Isaac Lukanda, SABC, Dar es Salaam.
Let's take you back to our question of the day. Should other African countries follow Egypt's lead in restricting social media access for minors? Here's what you've been saying. Warunga says, of course, we nod. It's all right, we do. Sebastian says, I hope it's not another way of trying to silence the people. When African leaders say left, for your safety, start going right. Another one here says, more like an excuse to bring in digital ID. And Ms. Jackie says that that's literally the job of a parent, not the big daddy government. And we'll take more of your responses to the question around whether more African states should follow what Egypt is doing in trying to restrict internet access or social media access in particular for children, minors. So we'll take those later here on Unwrap Africa. Don't go away. Thanks for staying with Unwrap Africa this Sunday evening. So South Africa is losing billions of rands through its ports due to a combination of issues, including delays, congestion, and chronic equipment failures. The country is estimated to lose 1 billion rand each day in missed trade that is due to these issues. Tonight we look at the ways in which South Africa can secure port control, cut costs, and restore trade competitiveness. And to help us do that, we're joined by the Southern African Times CEO, Farai Muvuti. Good to have you on Unwrap Africa, Farai. Welcome. So I'll get to the reference that you've made to ports being power in a moment, but let's start first with the problems at the ports, especially in Cape Town and in Durban, and why it is that they've continued for as long as they've done.
Well, I think for context's sake, it's referenced off the back of an interview that we did with the one of the specialists in ports management, Darwin Delamark, at a recent conference that we hosted here in London. And I think one of the lessons we learned is about port control and governance. And one of the issues there is about not only African governments, but more in particular, South Africa, controlling not only the land of the ports itself, but the concession aspect, which tend to be privatized. And that has a problem in terms of governance and transparency and creating the particular duality between the ecosystem from space shore, space, and warehouse. And I think that transition area creates the dilapidated experiences that you speak of. So part of the issue is about creating a framework that works and that requires an efficient ecosystem that speaks to those realities.
And you've touched on it somewhat, but let's give a broader context as to why it is to the continent's benefits that South Africa's ports in particular operate optimally.
Well, South Africa supports quite a number of countries in terms of those that are inbound within the context of land-based countries. So it is a big economy within the context of the other countries it connects to that are landlocked. And so its shorelines create an avenue. And if those avenues are not actually well managed, there is a silent impact on inflation. And that inflation aspect has a regional impact. So without efficiencies, those things creep into our total balance sheet. So it's important that South Africa has a clear governance structure, especially one controlled not only by the external factors that we've mentioned earlier, but more fundamentally with the government structure that speaks to those realities. There is a tendency for African governments to ignore its shorelines, yet it's a critical avenue, as it is indeed an economic gateway.
As I referenced right at the beginning of our conversation, there's been mention of the phrase ports are power. What does that mean then in practical terms for Transnet, the National Ports Authority, as well as the South African economy more broadly, when these issues are still outstanding?
Well, if you look at a port, right, a port is somewhat of a gateway. And these are the expertise that I learned, by the way. And I often have to reference Darwin Telemark within our interview, because these are the expertise I learned from that particular interview, which, of course, can be seen on YouTube on the Southern African Times page. But the point is, ports should be looked at as a gateway to a country, inbound and outbound. So if I come to your gate and you're not welcoming, and you have terrible inefficiencies between how you welcome me to the point that I get to your house and how I then exit, my opinion of you is going to be very poor. And that has a market perception. That market perception has an impact on it, whether, markets respond in terms of that being a gateway to go to. Ports are an entry point to any country. So there's a need to create those particular efficiencies. So I think the simplest way to put it is that South Africa's ports are its external gateway, and from an outbound and inbound perspective.
So in terms of reform, the idea at this point is to possibly pour more into private sector participation in the ports mix. How then do you separate efficiency gains from the deeper question of strategic control over gateways?
Well, I think this is a good point. This is a good question. But remember, ports are already privatized currently in South Africa. Most African economies do not control their own ports. Most of the concessions are let out to your DPW, your different, in terms of ownership structures, the major shoreline players. And the issue here is not necessarily about the privatization, because people tend to think that privatization creates those efficiencies alone. But I think there should be a duality here, where you have local participation, and part of that has to be about raising skill sets that involve the local economy within the port management itself. So there has to be, like I said, a coordination between the private sector and the public sector in order to create these efficiencies. Public sector, because they are elected to ensure that these efficiencies are present. Private sector, it's then to ensure that there's a sustained efficiency process.
And on that point, is it at this stage a matter of there being an underestimation, perhaps, on the part of the people currently responsible for these ports of, let's say, the unseen costs and perhaps some of the other complexities that come with running an efficient port service?
Well, I wouldn't know if it's an under participation or rather underestimation of what that requires. But what I could say is this: at the end of the day, a lot of African governments have a number of issues to deal with that are on a day-to-day basis that are probably focused on the day-to-day basics, which is your commodities, and ensuring that people are fed, healthcare works, education is systematic and matches the reality of parity. But in that context, there should be a conversation around how we balance these issues, because a lot of the shorelines are still colonial. There has not been a drastic shift in terms of, one, ownership structure, two, just the patterns of how the ecosystem works. For example, not a lot of African countries own their own ships, and nor do they export to major shorelines. And so a critical thought about looking at this, we're leaving billions on the table by not equally participating in these global realities, especially given the fact that geopolitics is changing. So without performing or participating in this global reality, we are left behind. So if we are going to talk about the Africa Free Trade, for instance, and talk about logistics, then we literally have to talk about the bolts and nuts of it all, right, which is owning ships, participating in the shoreline, and equally having that ecosystem. It's not enough for us to just own the land. We must be able to be part of the concession contracts we issue.
And it's a matter of great frustration and great cost for both the entities that run the ports and indeed business. I mean, in South Africa at the moment, Farai, there's a case, in fact, that I was reading in the week is likely going to go to court where fruit exporters are quite upset that their produce is not able to get out of the country fast enough and might then go to waste. But I want to talk about another thing that's around illicit flows around these ports. In your experience then, what would be the top three, let's say, governance measures that would need to be looked at or put in place to reduce corruption and illicit flows?
And yet again, I must cite that the expert here is Darwin Telemark, with the interview that I benchmark here. But I think the issues that he raises are three. One, it's about governance. So governance talks to transparency, be it digital, be it automation. Equally, it talks to skill set. So skills development is equally critical within the maritime business. But more fundamentally, I think the final one is that particular hindrance between the space of offshore to the warehouse. So creating fluidity within that ecosystem creates the particular realities of greater efficiency, inbound or outbound. So the complaints you're citing can be easily dealt with if governance does take measures, not only from a policy level, but equally from fundamentally a devolved level of creating local participants through skills development.
Farai, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with us on Unwrap Africa this Sunday. We appreciate your time. Farai just helping us to make sense of the situation at the country's ports and on the continent in terms of bringing in an income, a much needed income for countries like South Africa. This is Unwrap Africa. Thanks for staying with us. We asked you at the beginning of the show tonight whether other African countries should follow Egypt's example in restricting social media access for minors or children. Let's look at your responses. One here says that yes, and also children under 15 should not be allowed to have or own smartphones. Another one here in agreement from Shone Zumbani. Tegelo says, with effects and exposure, I would say yes, social media is anti-social. And then a longer contribution here from Igifaru, who says that interesting question, limiting social media access for minors, as Egypt has done, could protect young users, but it also raises debates about freedom, education, as well as digital inclusion. Should other African countries strike the same balance? And then one last one that we can look at now is one here that says that life has moved on and he's still stuck in 2023. Not sure who he is, but there we go. Well, Thabang PeuYaAfrika Makgakwe is a Global Citizen Fellow alumni. The young multidisciplinary artist is a storyteller, an activist, and a cultural ambassador. He fuses rhythms of drums, poetry, and dance to paint a vibrant picture of the African continent. Our producer, Nonhlanhla Mthembu, has been to spend some time with him.
And share our stories with pride.
And share our stories with pride.
Unwrap Africa brings you PeuYaAfrika. We hear all about his love for the continent. He wishes young people had more interest in who Africa is.
I'm a young person who's passionate about art and empowerment, but also the growth and the power and the influence of Africa. I've worked in different places, communities, but the one that I'll always look back is the one in Rwanda, in Kigali. I attended a Move Africa when I was a Global Citizen Fellow, which now I'm Global Citizen Alumni. And my interest was learning about the art and culture of young people in Kigali. That was I'm super inspired. For me, it was not only about activism, but it was also about network out of the borders. By the year 2050, Africa is going to have the largest youth population. It means now the workforce, the creative, the art, the leader, they will be coming from Africa. I still believe there will be a time where there will be a young president who's 24 years in Africa, a young minister. I've seen in Botswana when we have young ministers, and I'm super inspired. It shows that young people have been trusted. This attire, it shows the power of leadership, but also respecting where we come from, but also where we are going. These shells represent currency. Shells used to be currency in Africa. The reason why I wanted my suit to be with shells, I wanted to work with currency of the heritage. We have a lot of powerful stories in Africa, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, and then our differences matter. So I want the young people to always acknowledge that, because that's how we are going to grow, but also it's how we are going to shape this continent, motherland, Africa.
And that'll do it for this edition of Unwrap Africa. Thank you so much for watching. As always, we're back with you 8 p.m. right here on SABC News next Sunday. Stay with SABC News. Bye-bye.